As you know, I've been working on the 65 Mustang known as Mystique, and I've been working on the core support and fender aprons. I have the right apron and the core support, but the left apron that I got was bent, so I'm going to have that replaced. So I'm going to move on and do some other things on this car. The left quarter panel had been worked on, or the whole car had been worked on at a body shop, and I'll show you what they did to the inside. And this isn't that bad, it's just not great. They made this patch panel and kind of tacked it to the car, to the inside, and made a secondary patch panel down there. And again, not the greatest, but it would do the job. And they also did some work on the outer wheelhouse. The owner doesn't like any of this, and I don't blame him. So we're going to address that. On the passenger side, there's a couple of patches stuck to the car somehow, and there's also a bunch of Bondo piled on out here. So along with that, there's some rust through at the left floor pan. There's some damage up there, you can see rust through. And then on the passenger side, it's not too bad, but there's a bunch of pitting and stuff in this pan as well. So that's going to be addressed. Now to do all that, I've been provided with a patch panel to go on the passenger side. This would normally be a filler, and I hate the way they box these things because they always bend them in half and stuff them in a box. But I won't be using that one in particular, but that would normally go right here. I also have an outer wheelhouse for the driver's side and a full quarter panel as well. Beyond that, I've got this. Now this is a full trunk pan. This comes, this goes all the way up into the passenger area. That's a cross brace that would hold your shock mounts. That's a very heavy piece. I won't be using that. It also comes with, over there, these are your, what would be your tie down for your spare tire. There's a couple rubber plugs for the filler holes up here, and then there's some rubber bushings for your bump stop, basically on your rear end. So this comes complete as an assembly, and that's good. I like that. But I'm going to have to do some modification. In order to get this even in the car, I'm going to have to remove the quarter panel. Well, I don't have to remove the quarter panel, but I'm going to remove the quarter panel. And I'm also going to remove the tail panel. So I will probably replace this tail panel with a new one. It's not bad, but it does have some Bondo work going on here, and there's some rust down in the seam. So I'll be further ahead just to replace it. I'll also replace these. They didn't come with the kit, but I'll get some of those on order. And I don't want to replace this whole pan, because in order to do that, I'm going to have to come up and go underneath the floor pan. That's going to be pretty challenging without having to separate a lot of things. So I'm going to leave that part in there because it's solid. What I will probably end up doing is cutting this somewhere along this line, and then maybe up around where these spot welds are here. I will also have to redo the welds to the inner wheelhouses on both sides, and then of course weld this back down to the frame as it should be. That'll eliminate all the rust and make this a very solid car. It's a little bit more challenging to do this basically as an assembly, but it'll turn out really nice and it'll look really good. Yes, I get to use a plasma cutter again. As you can see, I've removed the quarter panel, and now you can see more of the patches that were put in. And there was a little piece down here that they used to weld it to the inner structure of the rocker panel. I had to grind out a bunch of filler in here, so it looks like, I don't know, they were trying to do several things with this patchwork. The other thing, the outer wheelhouse was rotted through, and this is sort of attached, but they should have fixed that. I wouldn't have put that quarter on, or that patch on top of that. So I'll end up lopping off all this stuff because I'm not going to use it. I'm just going to replace these pieces since they're available, and these are pitted up and rusted. It'll be just simpler to remove those. I will salvage the brace for the tail panel and where the trunk latches, and in this case there were just a couple of spot welds that I just drilled through and broke the welds. I also will salvage these pieces. They do make them, but these are much better than what they reproduce, so I will reuse that. And this one I may leave intact and in place, since I'm not removing the quarter, I'm just doing a patch on the bottom. But when I do that, it'll expose the bottom of this side of the floor or trunk pan, so I can get access to it as well. Alright, well, I'm making some progress. As you can see, I've cut out some pieces in the back here, and I've trimmed out the main opening. I stayed away from the frame, the rails. There's a flange, and I bared the metal on all these spot welds so I knew what the flange was, and then I made sure I stayed away from it. So I cut out the main inner structure there. I also cut off the perimeter of the outer wheelhouse, and I'll have to do some separation. I will drill through these spot welds, because when a new panel comes up behind it, that'll create the welding surface that I need. On this section here, where what makes up the window opening on the inside, these are 3 panels together. You got this panel, the outer wheelhouse, and the inner wheelhouse, and of course they're all sandwiched with a spot weld. So I will drill through these so I can separate it and get this outer wheelhouse out of the way. I'll have to do some work down here to separate this piece, and as I go along I will drill through these spot welds only to the point of separation of that rear panel. I don't want to go forward because I don't need to, so I will find that stop point and drill through, because when I put this new pan in, it'll create the weld surface that I'm going to use in here, so that'll take care of that. I still have the passenger side sheet metal to separate from the trunk pan, and I took the patch panel, set it up in place, drew a line, and then drew another line. That'll be my cut line. That'll leave me some material to work with as I need to trim and fit the new piece in place. I will retain the rest of the quarter panel, the taillight pocket or filler piece here, and of course this piece which makes up the corner of the trunk opening. Okay, this will probably be the last segment of this video. I've got all the sheet metal removed from the top of the frame rails on both sides. I also drilled out the spot welds that were on the inner wheelhouse, and these ended up just a little bit bigger because I believe when they made these spot welds, the machine may have twisted a little bit and oblonged or kind of mushed the metal, so it makes a hole a little bigger. I've also removed the material from the back side of the outer wheelhouse, and that's where this finished panel connects right here, so that had to be cleaned off. Here's the end of the frame rail, and these are those flanges I talked about earlier, and there's also some spot welds going up from the bottom. I've trimmed off the material, give a nice straight line, and squared up the sheet metal from this forward section of the floor pan. I think I mentioned before I might do a butt weld, but I've decided I like a lap weld better, so I will do a lap weld across this whole perimeter, and it'll make it a little more solid. I've done some more thinking on this outer wheelhouse. This section of the wheelhouse, I've removed the material, and the thing is, whenever they put these together, this one they used some sort of a roller as a welder, and it had a bunch of grooves all the way through here, made it very difficult to get apart. And I thought, you know, if it's that difficult to get apart, am I really gaining anything by separating all of this material? So what I've decided to do is section in the wheelhouse. I already have a line. I've got the perimeter in place. I can just weld these holes back shut, no problem. I'll trim this up a little better here, and then I will make the new panel basically puzzle piece into that panel, and then I'll weld it all back in. It'll be good and solid. Just didn't really make much sense to bust all this stuff apart and then, you know, fight to get it back in. And I've dealt with these before, and I've had some difficulty with the fitment of these wheelhouses, but I think if I do it this way, it'll fit much better. I've already separated the panel of the floor pan repair, kind of already done some prep work on it, but I'll cover this more as I get into the assembly of this back half of the car. In my previous video, I removed the trunk pan, the tail panel, outer wheelhouse, quarter panel, various sheet metal, and today I'm going to work on getting those pieces, or some of those pieces, installed. So as you can see, I did my prep work on my frame rails and removed any excess weld material or metal that was there, and sprayed them down with that weld through primer that I'm using, that new stuff with zinc and copper in it. Along with that, I had put the pan up in place and traced the frame rails so I knew where they would be when they joined together, and that gave me a place to drill my holes and make sure that they were in the right locations. Now along with that, I used some of the leftover sheet metal from the trunk pan as a template so I can get those welds in basically the same place. I also have my new tail panel over here, and I've got my left and right bracket reinforcements for the bumpers, or bumper. So I'm going to work on getting that tail pan, the floor pan in place, and then progress from there. Now what I like about this dynacorn sheet metal is it's already coated in weld through primer. And I've had some people ask about my welding technique and how I do it, so I'm going to try to do a little shot of welding up a couple of these holes on this panel. Now when I do this, I start at the edge and I work my way around the perimeter of the hole and then come back into the center. Okay, so the trunk pan is fully welded in. I'm very happy with how it turned out. You can see the spot welds turned out nice. I did weld that perimeter as I talked about, as I would do, and the other welds down the other side. And of course I did the end pieces and also the bottom. And I've also welded the perimeter here on the outer wheelhouse on both sides. What I'm starting to do at this point is fit this piece, this outer wheelhouse. And I'm running into a little bit of a situation that I'm trying to figure out. I'm working this out as I go. As you can see, I've got pieces cut out and I've cut off that front flange area. But the challenge is going to be, and if any of you have seen my the trouble I had on that blue Mustang fitting the quarter to the wheelhouse, I think this is part of the problem. If I pinch this in and I follow this radius, you end up with a big gap. Sorry, you end up with a big gap on the other side. For whatever reason, when they stamp these things, this company is not working together with whoever makes these other pieces. Same way if I pinch this side, creates a big gap on that side. Now the difficulty is I've got to make that wheelhouse fit, and I have to make the quarter panel fit. So I may have to do some little bit of trickery here. Let's say I may have to section the wheelhouse in half. At least that's what I'm thinking at this point, and make the front half fit and make the back half fit, and then re-weld it back in the center. I know that's a lot of work, and some people are going to say, well, geez, why don't they make the thing fit? Well, I wish it was that simple. So just some of the things you have to deal with on these cars, because not all these pieces are as good from one manufacturer to the other. So that's kind of where I'm leaning right now, is making two pieces out of that wheelhouse. But in this whole process, I'm going to just set those pieces in place and mock up the quarter panel as well. Because even if I had those right, or if I have one half right, the other half wrong, I will have trouble with this as a finished product. Alright, so I'm going to move along and get the quarter panel to fit properly, and I think that'll help me whenever I lay out the final cuts or dimensions I'm going to use to make this outer wheelhouse fit. Couple things I'll point out. If you look at this flange right here, there's usually 3 spot welds that hold the quarter to this deck filler piece. This is also one of the areas you will find braze. You also find braze up here, and typically you'll find braze down in this corner where the quarter panel overlaps the door jamb. There will also be a series of spot welds inside here that you have to get loose, and of course the perimeter spot welds at the door jamb. Now, normally if you were replacing sail panel, everything else, this quarter panel goes up behind, and I can't really show you that very well, but there's a flange. In fact, it looks like this, and this sinks way up in there, kind of like that. Sorry. And the sail panel or roof panel assembly overlaps that. I don't want to cut into that because there's too many things to move to make this come up behind there. So as you can see, I cut off that material. Now I did come out of this curve just a little bit and cut this off pretty much square, and then angled it back up into this panel here. And I'm basically doing the same thing with the quarter piece that I removed. So here's that cut. And again, this is just my initial cut. I will be trimming it up as needed once I get it up in place. But let me put it up, attach it to the car with some clamps, and I want to show you something else. Okay, so the quarter panel is just roughly set in place. This by no means the final fit, but I do have a pair of vice grips holding it back here, and these 2 pieces now are almost dead on with each other, so I'm happy with that. You can see now up here how this will go underneath this panel, and again, this is not final fit, so I have more to do, and I still have some trimming to do up here. But what I really want to point out is some of the problems you run into with these panels is how they're made. If you look carefully, if you can see it, the rocker panel is angled up, and this flange is actually angled down. So you have to take that panel, that edge, and dolly it up to try to mimic that angle. Another thing is there's a little cutout, usually right here, where my finger's pointing, and sometimes you have to make that bigger because it'll interact with this panel and it won't go in very well. So you have to enlarge that opening to make it fit around this panel. So I'm going to play with that and see if I can't mock up this quarter just a little bit better. I've nibbled off some more metal, got this a little closer to where I want it. One thing I'll point out too, and I'll work this out later, is there's lead down here in the seam, and you can maybe kind of see it there. This metal looks kind of thick, but the top part of that is lead, and that's where I cut that out right there. So you want to go over this, make sure you get all the lead out. Usually I use just a little torch to take care of that, because obviously you can't weld to it. I've got the panel fitting a whole lot closer on that bottom, but one thing I want to show you, and I've run into this before, and this is where it's going to be important to mount the door actually, because there's some movement. I don't know if you can see my hands. There's some movement up here, and if you'll notice, if you push this down, you got the old witness marks of where the panel was. If you push this down, you see how that bows out? So you can see there's a lot of variation in shape there that can happen, and you don't want to just put this panel on and assume that it's going to fit. So I highly recommend, and this is what I'm going to do, is I'm going to remount the door so that I can latch the door shut and then use that as my guide for final placement of the quarter panel. This is a continuation really of the Mystique Part 5 video. In that video I showed how I installed the trunk pan, and I was working on the fitment of the quarter panel and the wheelhouse. And I talked about how the wheelhouse didn't fit the quarter panel very well, and I was going to section it. So that's what I've done. I've actually split it a little past center, and the reason I did that was when I put the wheelhouse in the quarter panel, I could find a good, let's say a happy place to where that part of it fit. And then same with the other piece, I could find where it fit. So that's why I split it right there. So at this point, I have the back half, let's say, of the outer wheelhouse clamped in place. There's a clamp there, a couple clamps there. And I've already mocked it up with the quarter panel, but I'm gonna show you what else I did. I took the front half, and after trimming and fitting, and I did this with the quarter panel on the car, and I can show you that too, but I wanted to show you the fitment. Now I've got a pretty clean gap. There's a little bit at the top there, but that'll fill with weld. And now the quarter panel fits the wheelhouse. So let me hang the quarter panel and show you what I'm talking about. I have the quarter panel clamped in place. One clamp up here at the top and one clamp here at this back section. And now, I know it's really hard to tell, but I've got a real nice small gap, if any gap at all really, on the quarter of the wheelhouse. And then also, it's hard to see up here, but same thing, real nice and tight. And I may have to get underneath the car to show you this, but the fitment here, there is really no gap. So I'm really happy with that. And same way with the front, there's really no gap there as well. I know it's hard to see. I know it's a lot of work, and in one of my videos somebody made a comment. They said, I love how anal you are about this stuff. I hate to say it, but I am. And I'm much happier doing it this way than having to really, I don't know, go out of my way to modify things later. By doing all this stuff up front, test fitting, cutting, refitting, recutting, I will save myself a lot of trouble when it comes to the final welding and assembly. So I'll drive on from here. What I'm going to do is I'll take this back apart. I will drill holes in the wheelhouse where I'm going to weld it to the car, and I'll start with that rear half and get it attached to the car, and then work my way forward. And again, I'll keep on, fitting the quarter panel on and off until I'm really satisfied with it. Another thing I'll point out is this door gap. I'm really happy with that. Once I had the door set and got this in place, and I talked about how you can change the shape here, and that can still be done just by pushing on it a little bit, but I will do all that final fitment whenever it comes time to attach the quarter permanently. So now I have the back half of the outer wheelhouse welded in place, and you can see the welds that I used. Drilled my holes and then did my plug welds, welded the seam along the top here, and then I installed the front half, and it's not fully installed yet, but I welded the seam and I started putting in little tacks around the perimeter, and so I'll finish welding that tomorrow, and I've got started on the inside as well. I'm pretty happy with it. And also I took my just a little simple torch and I heated up this edge here like I talked about, and you can see there's that overlap that I was talking about earlier, and I've cleaned out the lead, and then I've hit it with a grinder just to make sure I don't have any lead left in there when I weld. Now I have both halves welded together and welded to the car, And I did take my sanding disc and grinder and smooth down all the welds, and then I sprayed them with self-etch primer, and I used seam sealer to make sure everything was nice and tight. So those are in place. There's seam sealer back here where this panel meets Wheelhouse. We'll still need to seam seal the inside up in here, but I'm not worried about that right now. I'm going to finish that up once I get everything in place. So I prepped all the holes on the wheel arch down here where this part meets the rocker panel, and then of course the holes that meet the door jamb. I've also sprayed it with weld through primer, that copper stuff I'm using, and I've prepped the remaining holes up here and did my final fitment on the quarter. And so I'm ready to install the quarter panel, and I'm really happy with how this thing is fitting now that I've done this extra work to make sure the Wheelhouse is correct. Well, that's all I'm going to do for today. I did get the tack welds up here at the top of the quarter and welded the perimeter of the Wheelhouse and the arch. So, happy with that. I've also got some of the welds in up here at this corner. And just to show you something here, I put this strap between the quarters, and the reason I did that was to put a load on this quarter panel so that when the deck lid closes, I've got a gap that I like, and that gap is pretty even and pretty much the same on both sides. So what you find is this quarter may want to spring out just a little bit, and during the fitment process and before you weld, make sure you have that gap right. And you can also pre-fit the tail panel and see how well that fits. I did that a little bit and I'm happy with it, but I'm not ready to install it yet. So I had to strap on, pulling a slight load on the quarter, and then I welded it in place. I'm pretty happy with the fitment. I haven't done anything up front yet where the door jamb welds in. I did a couple spot welds down here because I knew that angle had to match on the rocker, and I'll get to that on the next shot. So to finish off this video segment, I just wanted to show you the work here. I did weld the front edge here at the door jamb. I did weld the top where it meets the quarter meets the old quarter or the roof line, and also welded it inside there. And as I talked about earlier in the video, and I highlighted, make sure your gaps are right, because once it's welded on, that's it, unless you want to cut it all back apart. Here, I'll show you the door fitment. I'm very happy with the fitment. Gap is nice. I know with the color differences really kind of throw you off a little bit, but I'm very pleased with how this quarter fits. The next video segment, I'll just give you some highlights on it. I've already filmed a good bit of it, but I ran into problems fitting that tail panel. Okay, so as I progress through the assembly of these panels, I want to show you a couple things. This panel is, from my understanding, an American-made stamping, and it's a little different than the foreign brands, and I'll show you that in just a second. But in mocking up this tail panel, I'm going to show you one problem that I'm going to have, and that's down here where the quarter panel is a little bit longer than this trunk pan, and that's going to be something to work on. You can see the gap there, but if I try to rotate the tail panel in, there's too much of a gap. So my fix is going to be breaking loose the spot welds in this corner, working this piece forward a little bit, and then working this piece up a little bit and back in. It's a minor repair really, but just something to take note of. Again, these quarters, they vary from company to company. So that's going to be a one fix. want to show you on the tail panel, which I'm pretty happy with overall. The stamping is really nice. It's thick. It's got the holes for the bumper mounts appear to be in the right places. So I'm pretty happy with all that. But one difference I've noticed is this little flange right here. On the Chinese version or Taiwan, this is already in the correct shape. So in this case it's bent this way and it needs to be straight up so that it mates with this tail panel. But the biggest problem I have is this part right here. And what's supposed to happen is when these are assembled, this part wraps over the top of this part. And if you can look, I don't know if I can't really show you a measurement, but those are actually the same width. So I'm gonna have to play with this some more. Here's the original panel, or what's left of it. And if I put these two pieces next to each other, you can see there's a difference in width. And the leg there is shorter than the leg there. So I don't know if they just got the stamping wrong or the tooling is slightly off, but it's just something to take note of. But this is a panel that was available, so I used it, and I'll make it work. I'm just pointing this out so that for future reference you may want to be looking towards the Chinese or Taiwan version and using that instead. So here's what I've done. I've taken a drill and drilled out the 2 spot welds that were holding these 2 panels together. You can see it there. And then this rolled right into place. Gently tapped on it and took a pair of needle nose vice grips and reshaped it a little bit and got that forward. And now I'll take a dolly and come in behind and tap this up and reshape that so it closes up that gap. I'm much happier with that now. And stuff like this isn't that hard. You just have to kind of understand how the metal goes or how it was put together and how, you know, you can take things apart and readjust them. You shouldn't have to, but sometimes you do. And this is all I used. One of these old steel dolly blocks and a body hammer. And again, I'll come back and weld those holes shut, and that'll take care of this side. And then I'll play with that side a little more because I may end up putting this patch panel in first before I finish putting in the tail panel. I think it just makes more sense to do that. Okay, I've had enough. I tried and I'm so frustrated I've given up on this tail panel. I pointed out several things earlier in the video segment, and that was stuff like this little flange here that's not bent the right way, the width of this channel, even the shape of the little tabs that are supposed to hold your wiring harness aren't right. The panel, I didn't realize it when I first pulled it out and started working on it, but it's supposed to be straight, and it was straight all the way across. I actually started forming it into a curve because if you look at the deck lid, it has a subtle curve all the way across, and you have to make your tail panel match that. So along with those things and the fact that I kept having to push it forward to make it fit, it's only clamped in two spots down at the bottom, but it shouldn't be springy like that. And so I gave up and I bought an original tooling tail panel. And I'm going to set that in place and show you the difference. Okay, so there's the new original tooling tail panel in place. Everything fits. It wraps around up here just like it should. That flange that I talked about earlier is in the right angle. The pocket down here, this all matches the way it should. It has that more pronounced recess that wraps around this filler panel. It lines up pretty close on the notches here up to the dynacorn trunk pan, but I mean it just fits. And really I didn't have to do anything but set it in place. I have one pair of vice grips holding it, otherwise it would just slip right on. The other thing, it has the subtle curve that it's supposed to have. And when I close the trunk lid, it fits. Imagine that. So there you go. Don't buy that thing. Get this original tooling panel. Now I will still have to prep it, obviously, with my weld locations, you know, in various spots, and I'll have to transfer the holes that are in the dynacorn pan like I did on that one, so that the screws are lined up for the you know, the filler panel or valance panel. And yeah, this is the one. If you're gonna do one, get this panel. There's a tail panel fully welded in place. You can see my weld locations in various spots here, and there's a few little pinholes that I gotta come back and fill in, which is not a big deal, but everything fits super nice. I still have these welds down here to grind all the way across, but I did make the hole locations for the rear valance panel, so those are ready to go. A couple things to point out at this point. This area right here, this part of the trunk pan that's sticking out right here, if you go to install the valance panel, you'll find that it's going to hit this, and it won't tuck up nice into this quarter. So what I always do is I come back and I cut that off to make clearance for that panel to come up further. If you look on the other side here, you can see how much is sticking out, and you really don't gain anything by having that there. So again, we'll cut that off and that panel will fit up tighter. Another thing I'll point out is these bumper braces or brackets, support brackets, however you want to label them. I'm not going to put those in yet, because if you look at the hole alignment, you've got an offset, and without having the bumper in my hand, I'm not going to weld those in yet. And the reason for that is I want to get everything in place, hold the bumper up against the car, and figure out the placement, and then I'll decide if I need to do something with the bracket, you know, lower it, or if I want to go with those holes and open this hole up in the tail panel a little bit more. This is an original tooling panel, so I would suspect that's correct, but I'm not going to do anything until I have the bumper in my hands. The only thing left to do is install this support brace. Also doubles as the hood, the trunk lid latch. And I prepped the area here and up here on top where I'm going to put it. You can see my center line mark. That's just a reference to put the mount the bracket left to right. But prior to putting it in, I'm going to seam seal this mating edge here. And as you can see, there's no gap. That thing fit so nice, but it still has to be seam sealed. And I particularly want to do that behind this brace while I have access to it, because once you put that in, you don't have any access. So beyond that, I still have to weld in this little spare tire holder, and that's about it really. Everything else has turned out really nice, and that should take care of the back end of the car. And I think my next video I will be addressing the front aprons and core support. Thanks for watching.